Newsfirst, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat.
And a very good evening to you and a warm welcome to Newsline Live, but it's a Zoom recording. And this evening, using the latest technology, as we must these days, our guest is the former senior deputy governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, and no stranger to our program, to our network, indeed, to the general public, is, of course, Dr. W.A.Wijewardena. Very good evening to you, Dr. Wijewardena.
Very good evening to you, Faraz.
Thank you very much for joining us. All this talk, and the problem is still the same. We have a dollar crisis, which has led to an economic crisis, which has led to a social crisis, and then I suppose it has also become a political crisis of sorts. But all that be as they may be, the fact is, Dr. Wijewardena, that, when the central bank raised the interest rates from about 9%, the treasury bills and the bonds, I'm talking about, from about 9% to 24%, this obviously affects the largest borrower, which is the government of Sri Lanka. So what impact has it had on the 9,000 billion dollars or rupees of government debt? What impact has that had?
Well, Faraz, actually, it should affect the largest borrower in Sri Lanka, the government of Sri Lanka, because it has now pay a higher rate of interest on all its borrowings.
Yeah.
Starting from, say, earlier it was 4%, then it went up to 12%, now it has gone up to 24%. But of course, this is a bitter medicine which the government of Sri Lanka as well as the people of Sri Lanka will have to take. The alternative had been worse than the rise in the interest rate, because by increasing the interest rate, central bank had been able to get all the funding requirements of the government from the market. Earlier, what happened was the market contribution was a very small segment of the total requirement. The balance had to be actually given by the central bank, which ordinary people would refer to as the money printing. Even now, I find this has been the common term used by the Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe. He also says he has got the cabinet approval central bank. So money printing had already been done in an excessive way in Sri Lanka. If you take the 28-month period beginning from January 2020, the total money printing during that period had been about 4 trillion Sri Lanka rupees, which was actually a 53% increase in the level which we had earlier. So it had already been demonstrated in an increase in the inflation rate in Sri Lanka. As at the end of May, the Colombo Consumer Price Index has risen to 40%, with the food inflation of 57%. But, the independent inflation trackers like still the hanky of the Johns Hopkins University, they have put Sri Lanka's inflation rate at around 119%. Yeah. So we are gradually moving towards a hyperinflation. To prevent that, the central bank has increased the interest rates.
Is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing?
Well, of course, given the crisis and given the level of the ailment that we are suffering, because remember, we are in the intensive care unit now, the whole Sri Lanka economy. So the 22 million people in Sri Lanka have been driven to the intensive care unit without drugs, without medicine, without proper treatment. So given that particular situation, what the central bank has done is the correct monetary policy action. But what the Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe is planning to do is actually he's trying to reverse the situation by getting the central bank to print more money in order to pay salaries for the government servants.
Right. Now then, but some time ago when we had a different governor of the central bank, and they printed a lot of money. When we mean print, it doesn't mean minting only. It obviously, the issuance of bills and bonds is also an instrument of raising money. So I thought I'll just make that, because a lot of people just think that it's only to do with the physical minting of the money. But at that time, they complained. Now, the Prime Minister says, oh, look, we need to print 1 trillion rupees, with a T, trillion rupees, because we need to pay salaries and so on and so forth to a very inflated public service sector. Is it right now? What's changed between the time of Mr. Cabral and now? What's changed? Why is there a need to print money now? If it was wrong then, why is it right?
Well, for us, in fairness to Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, he has no any other choice today. Main reason had been that the treasury, which he has inherited from his predecessor, Mahinda Rajapaksa, has been empty. In fact, it's not empty for us, it is negative. Because many people think that in Sri Lanka, we have a thing called this consolidated fund, built up under the Constitution of Sri Lanka. And many people are not aware that particular consolidated fund is an overdraft facility in the Ministry of Finance. And that particular position means that there is no sufficient cash inflow to the government of Sri Lanka. If it doesn't have the cash inflow, it cannot pay salaries. And if it cannot pay salaries, it would lead to a serious problems with respect to the public services. So as a result, Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe doesn't have any choice today. But of course, I think he is actually doing the wrong thing right now, in my view. If he has no any other alternative than getting the central bank to print money and supply to the treasury, in the good name of maintaining the good macroeconomic stability in the country, he has to enter into an agreement with the Monetary Board of the Central Bank. Okay, you give me money now, but of course I'll be repaying this money in say 5 months' time or 6 months' time after I have put my Ministry of Finance properly in order in order to raise the required revenue from the market. So if he doesn't do that, what would happen is, presently, as I told you, there had been this 4 trillion that had already been created during the last 27-month period. If you get additional 1 trillion from the central bank, that will be actually created into 8 billion Sri Lanka rupees. So the total amount of money that would be printed by Sri Lanka during the next 12 to 18-month period would be around 12 trillion Sri Lanka rupees, and Sri Lanka will end up in a hyperinflation, which is more costly than the present economic crisis that we are facing. So that is why I want him to enter into an agreement with the Monetary Board of the Central Bank and give a timeline so that he would be reversing this particular position within a matter of 6 months' time, so that the adverse impact can be reduced to a minimum level.
And if we look at the US dollar rate, from about, let's have a look, from about 203 to now 365, an increase in rupee terms of 162 rupees to the dollar. Then, considering Sri Lanka's debt of 32 billion US dollars, then what is the what's the effect? Because our revenue is earned in rupees. So what is the effect? How is this going to affect us in terms of our repayment and sustaining these debts?
First of all, for us, I'll have to correct your position. This 365 rupee per US dollar, which is being announced by the central bank daily, does not exist in the market. That is, it is exactly like the 203 rupee per US dollar, which had been maintained by Lakshman and Ajit Kumar Cabral previously, because during that period, they were just, having that number in the books, but there were no dollars in the market. Similarly, today as well, even though the central bank is publishing this 365 rupee per US dollar as the exchange rate in Sri Lanka, there are no dollars in the market. People have to wait in the queue, or they will have to buy dollars from the black market, where the rate has been around 400 to 425 rupees per US dollar. That's number one. Number two is the amount of this foreign debt in Sri Lanka is not this 31 billion. In fact, there had been a fine cooking of the statistics by the central bank. where most of the dollar-denominated debt owned by the Sri Lankans had been transferred from the foreign debt category to domestic debt category, as well as the central bank had, when it recorded the international sovereign bonds, instead of recording the total debt liability of Sri Lanka, they have recorded it at the market price, which is about 50% of the actual liability. So when you add when you make the adjustment to the numbers, the total amount of foreign debt owned by the government of Sri Lanka as well as the private sector will be about 60 billion US dollars as at the end of the year 2021. And also if you add the guarantees given by the government of Sri Lanka to public sector entities like the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, CEB, Bank of Ceylon, and all these institutions to borrow money from abroad, the total foreign debt in Sri Lanka is 69 billion Sri Lanka rupees, which is about 85% of the Sri Lanka's gross domestic product. So what I mean is that the total numbers have been cooked by the central bank, and as a result, the cabinet, the members of the public, and also the foreign donors had been misled by the central bank today.
So that's a pretty serious claim to make. But I, of course, have absolutely, I don't doubt what you say because you've been on our network from the year dot. If I remember rightly, since the dreaded scam, the bond scam. So I don't doubt your figures at all. But isn't this a terrible lie to perpetrate and sustain, especially when we have people at the Aragalaya who are insisting on the truth and nothing but the truth. They want accountability, they want responsibility, and they want the truth. What can we do about these lies? Isn't it very bad
news? It's very bad news for us. It's very bad news because if you want to know the total commitment and the total liability that you have to meet, you must know the correct numbers. So that is why even when these, the foreign debt structuring experts who are to arrive in Sri Lanka today in a day or two, they will also figure because these numbers will have to be corrected first of all in order to before we meet with the debt experts, restructuring experts.
So the IMF already the legal team from overseas. From Britain, I believe, are already in Sri Lanka, the legal team representing Sri Lanka. But now when the people from the IMF turn up here, we'll have to tell them the truth because it's like going to the doctor. If you've got a headache and you tell the doctor you've got a headache and he'll treat you. But if he's got a brain tumor and all that business, the doctor needs to look into it.
Farah, because if we are to default Farah's today, it is not only the debt contracted by the central government that we have to default. Since we don't have any foreign exchange available even to maintain the essential import program for Sri Lanka, we have to default the debt contracted by the private sector as well as the debt that has been contracted by the state sector institutions on a guarantee from the government of Sri Lanka. And all these things will come to about 69 billion US dollars and not the 51 billion US dollars or the 38 billion US dollars which the central bank had been publishing. So this is a very serious thing, and the IMF team and the legal and the financial advisors on debt restructuring will have to take a fair and a realistic view of the total debt commitment of Sri Lanka before entering into a particular debt restructuring program.
But Dr. Wijewardena, why the lies? For heaven's sake, this is the central bank. What's the purpose of lying?
That is the thing that I cannot understand, Farah, because in a crisis situation like this, if you want to seek the assistance from the rest of the world, we will have to, in fact, come up with the true picture so that we would be able to come up with the crisis resolution program. But of course, in the past, what had happened is they had been using the wrong numbers. You may remember Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, while addressing the nation, he said that it had been wrong for the central bank to add this 1.6 billion US dollar swap facility, which Sri Lanka had got from China as a part of Sri Lanka's foreign reserves, because those resources can be used by Sri Lanka only if Sri Lanka's reserves would go up to 3 months amount of import. So still that number had not been corrected by the central bank. Still that number has to be corrected.
And on that note, let's go for a quick peek at this evening's headline news from that wonderful Newsfirst primetime news stream with Azra Hassan and her colleagues.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat.
Emotions run high at fuel queues as fuel crisis deepens. A quick game of cricket until fuel arrives. Will the fuel crisis cripple public transportation? Litro gas running empty. Maize farmers take to the streets. Politicians arrested over May 9th attack, granted bail.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat.
Welcome back to Newsline Live, but it's Zoom today. And we are, of course, in conversation with Dr. W.A. Wijewardena, the retired senior deputy governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Wijewardena, welcome back. But now, you know, the government, they recently announced a spate of tax increases. Income tax was rejigged, and, you know, we're all getting ready for Mrs. J to deduct our salaries, and our net return will be less now. But to begin with, Dr. Wijewardena, you know, these taxes now, does this mean that we have to pay to the PAYE system, or do we have to do it ourselves?
Well, for us, it's a good move by the new Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe to introduce these tax changes, because everybody knows the whole problem, the mother of Sri Lanka's economic crisis, had been the tax concessions given by Gotabaya Rajapaksa in December 2019, immediately after he became the president of Sri Lanka. Even at that time, the independent analyst had warned him not to do that, but he went ahead with that. By actually introducing the tax concessions, he lost tax revenue amounting to 600 billion Sri Lanka rupees per annum. And as a result, he had to borrow money from the banking sector to finance his budget. So the entire crisis, the mother of crisis, had been this particular tax concessions given. So it is actually logical and rational for Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe to introduce the new tax regime, but I would have expected him to go back to the tax regime which had existed prior to 2019. Because the present level of taxes for us had been only halfway through the tax reform, and it will not generate the adequate amount of revenue which he needs to finance his budget deficit.
And that was going to be my other question, but you've provided the answer before. I was going to ask you, I was going to say, isn't it true that despite all these tax collections and all that business, it's not enough, is it, to fund the actual requirement?
It's not enough, because the loss in tax revenue had been about 600 billion Sri Lanka rupees. What is to be raised by the increases in the tax levels by Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe would be around 400 billion Sri Lanka rupees per annum. He's still short of 200 billion, and that 400 billion had to be, I think, built in to the budget of the central government of Sri Lanka by introducing additional taxes in the future. Without doing that,
oh my God!
Yeah, I mean, already
additional taxes.
Yeah, already there is a proposal to introduce a social security taxation of 2.5% on the employers. which means again an additional tax that they have to pay. Now, remember, Faras, already the employees are paying the EPF contribution on behalf of the employees, ETF contribution on behalf of the employees. In addition to that, and another social security tax would be introduced, which would be about 2.5% of the income of the employers whose total annual turnover would be more than 120 million Sri Lanka rupees. So that is a new tax that is going to be charged on the employers. So likewise, they say, Faras, there is one thing that you cannot escape is the coffin that you might get at the end of your life, and the income tax people who are coming behind you to collect taxes. So we have to pay more taxes in the future because we have already ruined the system. Once we have ruined the system, there is no any redress for us to get it through the normal channels. So we'll have to pay more taxes, and we have to be prepared for that. And that is, there's no choice for Sri Lanka to do any other thing in the present economic crisis for us. Now, the main issue that we are having for us today is that the Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe very correctly had introduced some tax measures in order to fill his budget deficit. But of course, he has gone only halfway through, and there had been a proposal by the senior officers of the Inland Department for a comprehensive tax reform, which would enable the government of Sri Lanka to raise about 1,200 billion rupees per annum by way of new taxation. But what has been introduced by Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe had been only a few of the measures that had been suggested by the senior officers of the Inland Department. So what I mean is the revenue that he would be collecting as a part of the new tax measures would be insufficient to meet the entirety of the budget deficit that he is having. Because he may be able to raise about 400 billion through the new tax system, whereas he has already lost about 600 billion. So there is no any alternative available to him other than introducing new taxes. So there is a new tax proposal in the name of social security taxation of 2.5% to be levied on all the private businesses which would earn more than 120 million by of annual turnover. Now, already for us, the employers will have to pay social security on behalf of their employees in the form of EPF, in the form of ETF. Now, in addition to that, there's an additional payment of 2.5% which has been proposed. But of course, given the present economic crisis, I don't think there is any other solution available to government except going for new tax measures. So we'll have to wait for these new measures to be introduced by the government to fill the gap.
Goodness me, things are going to get even tougher. But now, tell me, Dr. Wijewardena, just before we we're coming towards the end of the program, tell me, how are we going to buy fuel? How are the public going to be assured of fuel? How are the thermal power stations going to be assured of fuel? And how are we going to, I know Britain has eased its travel advisory and so on, and so we may find a trickle of tourists starting to come. But, even if these brave tourists do come to Sri Lanka, and we need them to come, please come. But, what are we going to do about this fuel?
It's not only fuel for us. We have the basic shortage of foreign exchange to maintain the necessary import program to meet our medicine requirements, cooking gas requirements, essential raw material requirements. So all these things have been affected by the shortage of foreign exchange. So in all probability, the debt restructuring will take about, if it is successful, will take about another 5 to 6 months' time. And the debt restructuring is a precondition for the International Monetary Fund to come to help Sri Lanka. So in my assessment, the IMF facility would be received by Sri Lanka only by the end of the year. So during this period, we must have a bridging financing facility, and the only available source the friendly source for Sri Lanka has been India, because China is keeping its distance from Sri Lanka and all other countries are keeping their distance from Sri Lanka. So unless we get this bridging financing facility from India, we will not be able to meet our essential import requirements. So I hope that the government would be successful in establishing a better diplomatic relationship with India and get this facility until such time the IMF will comes and use as a bailout, which would enable Sri Lanka to raise funds from other sources as well.
Dr. Wijewardena, so therefore, the importance of Ranil Wickremesinghe comes into play, because Ranil Wickremesinghe, I think, it's common knowledge that he has pretty good friends in India. So all his friends in Chennai and in Hyderabad and Bangalore and where else will have to chip in and come to the aid of their friend who's trying to lead Sri Lanka out of the tragic.
Well, of course, those are as far as the personal level assistance to be extended to Sri Lanka, but that won't be sufficient, number one. Number two, that will not be sustainable. Number two, what we should get is the facilities from the central government of India run by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and that is very important for Sri Lanka to come out of the present economic, the foreign exchange crisis that we are facing in Sri Lanka today for us.
And in your opinion, having observed the numbers and crunched it and all that business, what do you think? Do you think these queues will ease? I know the young Minister of Energy, Kanchana Vijayasekara, is doing what he can, and he seems to understand and all that business. But what do you think in terms of the queues? What message can we send out to the people? Is it
well, of course, for us, we'll have to compliment the young Minister of Energy. But of course, you would have seen, he also has no alternative other than, extending quotas, rationing the fuels consumption by Sri Lanka. So rationing means, most of us will not be able to get the required amount of fuel to move about. And as a result, we may have to use the public transportation system from moving from one place to another. So the Minister of Transport will have to expand his transportation services to Sri Lankans. So there are so many adjustments that have to be done. But of course, since we are in the midst of the worst economic crisis which Sri Lanka had experienced, I think throughout its history, I don't say the post-independence, throughout its history, now of Sri Lanka, all Sri Lankans will have to come out together and make the maximum sacrifice possible in order to get out of this crisis today. So that's the message that I can extend to all my fellow citizens.
Last question, very quick question, last one. Do you think that Ranil Wickremesinghe has made the right choice in coming forward? Because usually Ranil Wickremesinghe performs well and best when he is the boss. And now he is obviously not, he's got one seat. So, good decision, bad decision?
Well, of course, we'll have to thank him for coming forward for us. There's no question about it. But the time will tell us whether he had been a success or a failure. So we'll have to wait patiently, and we cannot make a prejudgment today.
But let's wish him well.
We'll wish him well, yes. Or we'll give him full support in order to come out of this crisis.
Thank you very much, Dr. W.A. Wijewardena, former senior retired deputy governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. We really appreciate your time.
You're welcome, Faraz.
And that's it. So we've run out of time, as always. We could do with another 20 minutes, actually. But on that note, thank you to Dr. W.A. Wijewardena for his presence on Newsline Zoom. And it's now time for the primetime news, of course. But before that, as always, God bless you all.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.